Okay, folks. One of the first things that happened to me is I got a computer because I was trying to digest a lot of information. I'm talking about back in 1988. And I began doing what I just told you is a waste of time. Began cataloging all this information from UFO research and trying to remember what I had seen in these documents so that I could write it down accurately. And, over that period of years, you don't always succeed in being so accurate. But anyway, I was contacted by a lot of people, one of whom was Stanton Friedman, who called me on the telephone and wanted to talk to me. And we talked, and he sent me his curriculum vitae and a big stack of information and all this kind of stuff. And he wanted to know where I lived. He's the only one who I told where I lived, and not too long, and also where I worked. Not too long after that, people from the Defense Investigative Service came in and confiscated all of my computer disks. They didn't take the computer because it didn't have a hard disk in it, but they took all my floppies. And asked me a lot of questions and searched the house. And later, a man by the name of Jamie Chandray showed up sneaking around the college where I was the executive director. And it turned out that he had a talk with the owners, the board and the owners of the college. And pretty soon I found myself in a position where I had to resign, or the college was going to lose its federal aid. So I left. Jamie Chandray at that time didn't realize that I knew who he was. I recognized him. He was trying to play the sleuth. But Jamie Chandray was part of the team called Moore, Chandray, and Friedman, who released these phony documents called the Majestic 12 documents, or the MJ-12 documents. And I told everybody that I'd seen the name of William Moore and Stanton Friedman in documents with naval intelligence, and these people were working for the intelligence community. Nobody would believe me. A man down in Phoenix who ran a bulletin board service called Paranet kicked me off his bulletin board. His name was Jim Spicer, and said if William Moore turned out to be an agent, that he would kiss my you-know-what. Well, William Moore did turn out to be an agent by his own confession, but Jim Spicer, not being a man of his word, never did kiss anything, but he sort of has disappeared since then. And I had a habit of calling into CompuServe every once in a while and getting on the issues forum where they had a paranormal board where people would meet like on the weekends and discuss things like this. And one of the people who was on there was a guy by the name of Don Ecker. Later, I came to know that his name was Donald Francis Ecker III, and he lived up in Idaho, and he began calling me at home. We had a few conversations. I never did know him, never did meet him, never got to be friends. Then they had the MUFON convention in Las Vegas, and John Lear invited me to speak, and he also invited Don Ecker to speak. So we all showed up there, and Don Ecker gave this unbelievable, I told about the documents that I'd seen in naval intelligence and what I thought it all meant. And remember, at that time, I believed that this stuff was true. And Don Ecker got up and gave a big talk about aliens mutilating human beings and stealing bodies from mortuaries and all of these kinds of things. Later, he left Boise, Idaho, and went to California to become, quote, the research director of UFO magazine, end quote, and worked for Vicki Cooper, whom we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So don't go away. I'm going to tell you who Don Ecker is and who Vicki Cooper is and why you guys are being scammed by these people. Okay, so anyway, Donald Francis Ecker all of a sudden took a different tack and wrote, I think, 2 articles full of the most vicious lies I've ever seen printed in my life about me. For no reason. I'd never done anything to him at all. And so I began investigating him and Vicki Cooper, and I'd heard from a man by the name of Martin Cannon when I lived in California that Vicky Cooper was working for the CIA and was a government agent, and I just sloughed it off. I didn't pay any attention to it, but he wrote a letter to a friend of mine named Tal, and I put that eventually in the appendix of my book, which confirms what I just told you. He wrote the letter, and it makes all these accusations against Vicky Cooper, so I began looking into who Vicky Cooper was. What I found out was incredible. Don Ecker has told the world, and he is the one that people go to for this expert advice on UFOs. He's told the world that he was a police investigator, criminal investigator in the state of Idaho, and in about 8 other police departments across the country. Now, he never would tell anybody just exactly which police departments he worked for, just within the state of Idaho and several police departments across the country. He eventually got a radio show on satellite, and I called him one night when he was telling people that they needed to do research into who they were listening to and find out who they were. So I called up and said, "Gee, Don, you're telling us to investigate everybody that we listen to, but you know, you haven't told us anything about yourself. You said you're a criminal investigator and you've been a police officer. What police departments did you work for?" And he rattled off about 8. And then he said, "Oh, this is Cooper." And he shut me off the phone real quick, and then he wouldn't say anything else, and never did reveal anymore. But he gave us enough, and we have it on tape to go on, and we've called and written to every one of those police departments. And Don Ecker has never worked for any police department in the United States, period. Never. Not as a police officer, and not as a criminal investigator. He did, at one time, work for the Canyon County, Idaho, Sheriff's Department for a period of 6 weeks as a narc deputy trainee, a narcotics deputy trainee. He was fired after that 6-week period because he was doing things that sheriff's deputies are not supposed to do, and I won't go into that because it's not my intent to crucify the man, just to reveal to you that you're being scammed. The only law enforcement career that Donald Francis Ecker ever had was he was the lowest ranked prison guard at the Idaho State Prison, where he worked as a prison guard. He had to leave the Idaho State Prison when during a training exercise he accidentally shot his leg off with a 12-gauge shotgun. This is the expert that Larry King calls to be on the Larry King Show when he talks about UFOs and other people. Larry King has never investigated Don Ecker, or would never have attached his name to this scam artist. So, the next time you see him on television purporting to be having had a career, a long career in criminal investigation, a long career as a police officer on police forces across the United States, just remember that he was the lowest ranked prison guard, never received a promotion, who shot his own leg off with a 12-gauge shotgun during a training exercise, was fired from the Canyon County Sheriff's Office after working there for 6 weeks for cause, when he was a narcotics deputy trainee. We then began to look into why he left the state of Idaho. And folks, he left the state of Idaho because there were 2 warrants out for his arrest. I'm not going to tell you what the warrants are for. We know, but like I said, in my estimation, a man is not guilty until he's proven guilty in a court of law. But he did flee from the state of Idaho, which tends to indicate a certain degree of either guilt or a lot of fear of being found guilty. One of the two. And he has stayed out in California, except for ventures off to speak at UFO conventions and things, ever since. Well, when we found this out about Donald Francis Ecker, and we began to looking into the identity of Vicky Cooper, what we found was even stranger than you can even imagine. But we'll go to the phone because somebody's holding. They've been holding for a while, and then we'll get back into the story. Okay, back to the story. We began researching Vicky Cooper, and what we found out was incredible. We found out when she first came to Los Angeles to start UFO magazine, she didn't like UFOs, didn't know anything about UFOs, didn't want to have a magazine of UFOs, and made no bones about it. Everybody who knew her then said that that she just didn't understand what all the to-do was about UFOs, and she didn't know anything about UFOs, and she felt that the whole thing was government-controlled anyway. Nevertheless, she opened a magazine called UFO Magazine. It's a very small magazine, very small subscription base, maybe about 5,000 or 6,000 subscribers. And so most people in the country never heard of it, never read it, don't know anything about it. But nevertheless, it holds a lot of sway and a lot of weight in the so-called UFO research community, if you want to call it that. They really don't do much research, and they certainly don't look at all sides. They're not objective at all. And she holds a certain degree of control with this publication of UFO Magazine. What I found out about Vicki Cooper was astounding. I found out that her uncle was the lawyer who defended Sirhan Sirhan and has solid ties to the Johnny Rosselli mafia gang. And that there are people who know these people, make all kinds of insinuations and tell all kinds of stories, which I'm not going to repeat here because I never investigated any of those stories. I don't know if they're true or not, so I don't get into speculation. But we know there's that connection. We know that before Vicki Cooper came to Los Angeles, she was, in fact, an employee of Sidney Biddle Barrows. Now, if you don't know who Sidney Biddle Barrows is, let me enlighten you. She was also known as the Mayflower Madam, the blue blood prostitute, who ran a ring of prostitutes for big money politicians and foreign dignitaries and rich people who came to visit Washington, D.C. and the East Coast. Vicki Cooper was one of her employees. Well, when they busted this prostitute ring, they got Vicki Cooper and they threatened her with life imprisonment and every kind of despicable thing that you can think of. So Vicki Cooper sang, and she squealed on Sidney Biddle Barrows and all of her friends and fellow workers, and she was the state's witness that put Sidney Biddle Barrows behind bars for a lot of years. And if you'll remember, she just got out not too long ago and wrote a book. Now, we know that after she turned state witness, she had to leave that area. We know that somebody, we don't know who, gave her some money because she didn't have any money, and sent her to Los Angeles. When she got to Los Angeles, she didn't know anybody in Los Angeles, but a man by the name of Barry Taft met her, picked her up. He had already purchased, or not purchased, but rented an apartment for her, and his apartment was directly either above or below, I forget which, I have to look at my notes, but his apartment was either directly above or directly below hers. Now, this sounds innocent enough, but she didn't know anybody in Los Angeles, so who sent this guy to meet her? It gets even more interesting, folks. It seems that Barry Taft had worked for Louis Jolyon West of the Neuropsychiatric Institute of the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. And he had participated with Jolyon West in many of the clandestine Central Intelligence Agency and Office of Naval Intelligence and Army Intelligence G2 mind control programs. Isn't that interesting? And I also have a friend who had some information on UFOs, and Vicki Cooper visited him at his home. As she was leaving, she told him that UFO Magazine was funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. He wasn't the only one who heard that. There were two people there when she made this disclosure. So those are just two of the people involved heavily in disseminating all of this bullshit information on UFOs to an unsuspecting and very gullible sheeple public who don't question anything, don't look into anyone's background, don't seem to care if they're being sheared and led to the slaughter.